Shana Tova to you, to the entire congregation. It is always an honor and a privilege and a joy to speak to the congregation. As you so thoughtfully mentioned, my father-in-law, blessed memory, Alex Satmary, and mother-in-law, Violet Satmary, both enjoyed so much Hollywood Temple Bethel, and it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and I hope everyone will indeed enjoy a healthy, sweet, and safe new year. With that, what I will share is, particularly with respect to the college campuses, as we know, students are returning to campuses, some still virtual, some hybrid, and many back in person. And they are returning to different climates on their campuses. We have come off a season last spring and into the early summer of, as we all know, the escalation of conflict between Hamas and Israel, a mini war that lasted 11 days, and that was followed by severe episodes of anti-Semitism coast to coast, from Los Angeles to New York and many points in between. And on the college campus, it becomes a much more magnified and intensified environment. All too often, the extremes are represented on the college campus, and Jewish students are caught in the crosshairs of the so-called woke crowd, social justice warriors, of whom many Jewish students wish to participate and wish to be part of, and indeed have been part of social justice movement, the social justice movements of the last year and a half. But when it comes to Israel, when it comes to being a Zionist, when it comes to being someone who loves and feels that Israel is essential to their core identity, oftentimes that's where they are shut out of the conversation and pushed out of belonging to that larger group who care about wanting to create a better world. And so it really is a moment of awakening for students. And I think there is much that we can do as parents, as grandparents, and the students themselves on campus to reach out to campus administrators, whether that's through the Alumni Relations Department, which will surely find you when it becomes time for the annual campaign, or whether it's through the Hillel. The Hillel organizations have been stellar, have absolutely been outstanding on campuses around the country, and we partner very closely with Hillel. But it's important to make our voices heard and to help give the administrators, from presidents to chancellors across the board, the courage and the wherewithal to recognize anti-Jewish hate when they see it, to recognize when criticism of Israel crosses a line into anti-Semitism, and it's really not hard to distinguish that line, and to assure that Jewish students are able to learn and be part of their campus community, free from intimidation, free from intolerance, free from hate. And this is all too often a moving target, and it requires our steady, constant, daily vigilance and communication with students and with Hillel and with campus administrators. This is the work that is before us. AJC is in the midst, as we meet today, of organizing a campus administrators project interchange mission to Israel. It's something we've done in the past. University presidents have taken part, and when it is safe to go, when COVID protocols will allow, we will make that journey happen. And we already have several campus administrators, senior campus officials, who have pledged their support and their commitment to joining on that mission.
How do you explain this obsession in certain faculties with erasing Israel, uh, so that I might expect certain Mideastern studies to be influenced by faculty members who are from Arab countries. I might expect it, but I see it here. Women gender studies faculties, middle language faculties. It becomes an obsession. How to explain that obsession when people are supposed to be open-minded and supposed to present a balanced approach to issues? That's
Well,
academics.
What all too often happens is that the source of these insidious, particularly anti-Israel elements on campus coming out of faculty themselves are Jewish, and in perhaps out of a sense of wanting to be seen as completely academically independent and neutral, if there is such a thing, some of these academics will go out of their way to pillory Israel and to show that Israel can be criticized as much as any other country. And let me be clear on this. There is nothing inherently anti-Semitic about criticizing a particular Israeli government policy or action. As we both know, this is Israel is probably the most participatory democracy on the face of the earth. However, when that criticism, and this all too often happens, veers into questioning the very legitimacy, the very right of the Jewish state to exist among the family of nations, then we have waded into the waters of anti-Semitism. And we have a particular problem when it comes to faculty on campus. And again, part of what emboldens faculty is that holy grail known as tenure. That once a professor reaches tenure, they are effectively inoculated against any punitive action being taken against them in the classroom. It takes an awful lot to be able to rein in an academic who is hell-bent on pursuing an extremist agenda. And so it becomes a vicious cycle, frankly. And what we care about most is the climate of learning in the classroom. How does that affect, how does that pollute an environment that should be open, with open inquiry and genuine inquisitiveness and learning that we want to see on a college campus? This ultimately stifles that kind of academic freedom. That is the terrible irony of all of this.
You know, I am a student of history, studied Soviet and Russian history in college, and I can't help but thinking of the fact that Jews have been woke for a long time and always get it on the neck from both sides for being woke. And that the worst, for example, in the early years of the Soviet Union were what was called the Yevsektia, the Jewish section, whose job was to root out any Jews that had any kind of Jewish identification or affiliation. And then they themselves were purged and killed off when they were no longer useful. And it's very scary.
It's very scary, and I think it's an appropriate analogy to those who thought they could sit out and be on the sidelines, neutral to the just constant barrage of criticism that Israel was receiving during this last mini war, and the anti-Semitism that followed, that somehow was seen as justified or at a minimum not worthy of deploring and condemning, because its root cause was seen as Israel's so-called aggression during that conflict.
Okay, good, very good, thank you. So now that takes us, we're talking about college students. Now let's go to high school and middle school students. We have passed by the State Assembly a bill that in and of itself is very good, which said we should add ethnic studies. California is a state, it's almost a country by its economy and size. which is composed of people, so many different backgrounds. And our young people should know what was the experience, both the ups and the downs, both the hardships and then also the achievements. But it was turned into a hate fest in which it was focused only on a few minorities that seemed to be the highlighted minorities. Everybody else was ignored. Jews were ignored. Armenians were ignored. Southeast Asians were ignored. And they're like their preferred minorities, and all the grievances were put. And for example, in the case of the African American students, Dr. King and Abernathy and all the great people who fought for civil rights were ignored completely, and only the firebrands like Malcolm X were mentioned in this curriculum. And then on top of that, of course, it may use the Arab population here in California, people of Arab origin, as an excuse to pillory the Jewish community. So my understanding is it's been modified with a lot of fights. The people who originally set it up quit because they were angry that they didn't get to have their hobby horse. But there's a fear, as I understand, that school districts may still adopt the original program. What's happening with that?
So to your point, tremendous strides were made in the what became 4 distinct versions over a period of more than 2 years. This is really what greeted me when I arrived in Los Angeles 2 years ago, was that first draft of the model ethnic studies curriculum. It landed with a colossal thud and had all of the problems that you've identified. The 4th iteration ultimately carried favor and passed muster with the State Board of Education last spring, and it's pretty good. It's far from perfect. If we had perhaps started from scratch after that first horrific version landed, we might have come away with a better final product. But be that as it may, with all of the horse trading and pushing and pulling that went on over these last couple of years, the final product is pretty good. Where we now stand is exactly to your point, with individual school boards who will be required to adopt the curriculum. And some of those early architects, that the early drafters who have since washed their hands of the curriculum, are still out there. And they are parading their wares to individual school boards and asking that they adopt what they are referring to as liberatory ethnic studies. So essentially the first version, not the version that the State Board of Education passed. So as we gather today, the Illinois, forgive me, I still think I'm in Chicago, the California legislature, that's what 21 years will do in one place. The California legislature is considering Assembly Bill 101, which will make the teaching of ethnic studies a requirement for graduation from all public schools in the state of California, public high schools. So we are in the midst of trying to wordsmith and add some guardrails, some safeguards to that legislation that will require individual school districts to only use the official version that wound its way through 4 iterations and that ultimately was adopted by the State Board of Education. So we are hopeful that AB 101, which has the votes to pass, it will be a fait accompli in California, will at least contain language that assures and provides some comfort and certainty that the teaching of ethnic studies will in fact be inclusive and broad and reflect the rich mosaic of diversity that is our state.
I have a lot of fear about some of the local districts. San Francisco School District came out, the members of the board came out with absolutely bizarre statements during the course of this year. And the union spent its efforts in attacking Israel. And now UTLA has a proposition also on the board put by not a majority, a small community out of UTLA, but to lambast and blame Israel for everything wrong in education. I put it that way. And I don't know how to swallow this union, because I just saw an interview, it came out just recently, with the head of the teachers union, saying, no, that the children, for example, lost while they were in lockdown. They didn't lose anything. No, they learned resilience and they learned survival. They learned critical thinking skills. And they learned the word insurrection and coup. And somewhere here, somebody is not connecting. I spent 20 years in the field of private education, correcting the damages done to children in the formal classroom setting, both public and private school. And if I want to teach children resilience, I would send them to your father-in-law's slave camp to teach resilience,
Right.
not lock them out of the schools. So how do we deal with the school district like this? How do we deal with a teachers union like this?
Well, I think it's important to distinguish between the school board. So in this case, let's leave San Francisco to the side. I served with ADL for 8 years in San Francisco. It is a community unlike any other. When it's good, it's wonderful. When it's not good, it's a little cuckoo. But focusing on Los Angeles Unified School District has actually had an ethnic studies curriculum in place now for a few years. The state could have saved a whole lot of aggravation in Souris by simply looking to the LA model, which is thoughtful, incremental, subject to evaluation along the way. It's really a good and time-tested way to teach ethnic studies. So that said, the school district here is distinct from the union. The union tends to skew a little left, particularly some of its more fringe elements. And in a few days, LA Unified or UTLA, forgive me, United Teachers of Los Angeles, will be voting upon a resolution that, if passed, will put them on record in support of BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, what the United Teachers of Los Angeles has to do with the BDS movement is simply beyond my comprehension, but they've somehow found that a relevant subject. San Francisco, just to go back there for a moment, their union put it forward, passed it almost unanimously, literally in a 24-hour period. This has been a much more of a slow cooker here in Los Angeles. We are working in coalition with the Federation, with ADL, with several other organizations to present a unified front, and working with parents and teachers to see that this goes down to defeat. It's possible that it will be defeated on September 14th. It's possible that it will be deferred a few months down the road for later consideration. And there is the slim possibility that it could carry. We tend to think that it will not. But I do think it's just important to separate out the more responsible voices of the school board themselves. School board member Schmerlson, for example, put forward a resolution that passed unanimously 6 weeks ago, putting LA Unified on record against anti-Semitism. This clearly was a shot across the bow against what the mischief making that's afoot with UTLA. So we were very, very pleased to see that resolution come forward. And I think our challenge is to always try to seek out the responsible voices and try to overcome the more extreme elements who are entitled to their point of view, of course, but to legislate anti-Semitism, to legislate anti-Israel invective is simply unacceptable.
Okay, very good, thank you. And one last topic, like you said, we never know what happens till it happens. So sadly, we've gone through a tragedy where 13 Marines, most of them from the California area, were killed by terrorists as they were trying to save lives in Afghanistan. We have this withdrawal from Afghanistan, a precipitous collapse of the government of Afghanistan, And we're all worried about implications across the board in terms of the standing of the United States. How does it look to the world? And will other countries now still trust us for guarantees? One of the, obviously, the concerns is with the safety for the state and people of Israel. I was just in Israel this summer, had to get tested before I got on the plane, get tested after I got on the plane, get tested for blood tests so I wouldn't have to be locked in the room, get tested leaving the country. So they have enough trouble just with the virus. They still have Hamas on the border now testing them with crowds trying to break through the barriers, actions like that. And we also have new government, new approach, and we have the Abraham Accords, and those had a lot of promise. And looking at this now, do they still hold up? Is Israel's position in the Middle East stronger or weaker? What do you say?
Well, just a word first about the exit from Afghanistan. It is something that our government, the U.S. government, has been forecasting and awaiting. This was America's longest war. The exit was done in a way that has left many of us feeling as though there was a lack of careful coordination and planning. I mean, ultimately, people have been rescued, more than 100,000 airlifted out, and we as Jews can certainly relate to the plight of Afghans who are seeking safe harbor and seeking refuge, and that's a guiding principle that should underscore this next phase of helping refugees settle and resettle and find new lives and a new home here in the U.S. and other freedom-loving democratic countries. With respect to Israel, I would postulate that the new government, now a few months old, is holding pretty steady. It's certainly not a unity government, but it is a government that reflects the diversity and the true democratic nature of Israel, having everything from prime minister's party, which is far to the right, to an Islamist party, all under that same tent as part of this ruling government. That, to my mind, is a great message to the world about Israel's democracy, Israel's resilience, and the strength of the country's character and democratic foundations and principles. We are about to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the Abraham Accords. An early test of the Accords was, in fact, the Hamas-Israel conflict, and the UAE is the most prominent partner in the Accords, stood firm in support and squarely behind Israel. Now, that doesn't come without a message, and a message that the long festering Israel-Palestinian conflict still must be addressed. Ultimately, there needs to be a peaceful and satisfactory and equitable resolution of that conflict. And already, Prime Minister Bennett and his cabinet are making overtures to the Palestinians and at least finding ways, if not to discuss a final resolution of the conflict, at least finding ways to relate better to one another and work through some of the day-to-day realities of life in the region. So that's an encouraging and hopeful sign. But I would say to you and to the congregation that what we've seen over this last year is tremendously inspiring and hopeful as it relates to the Abraham Accords. More than 100,000 Israelis have visited UAE. We know Israelis love to travel, and they wasted no time going to visit Abu Dhabi and to be in UAE. And we're seeing exchanges of diplomats. We're seeing cultural exchanges. We're seeing life-saving organ transplants happening now between UAE and Israel. And so all of the, whether it's economic, educational, high tech, and governmental, we're seeing really the flowering of what should be a permanent, long-term, beautiful, evolving relationship. And so that to me is probably the best news when we think about Israel in the world and the state of U.S.-Israel and Israel global relations. The Abraham Accords have held up very well.
Yeah, that's why I find so ironic that Israel has now increasingly good relations with so many states in Africa. Israel is now warming up relations with Morocco. Egypt has a long-standing relationship. Jordan has. The countries that don't have warm relationship with Israel are the ones that are in the process of falling at each other's throats, like Lebanon, Syria. That's the irony. So in the rest of the world, Israel is fine. It is being made into a pariah state. Here, my people have no idea what's going on there. That's why it's so bizarre.
Well, and I think our challenge to that point, we have a lot of work to do in the new year to reach out to folks who are more left of center, frankly. It's very easy for us to identify because they identify themselves, the right-wing extremists and the crazies for what they are. We need to take them seriously, and we know that their hate and their anti-Semitism is longstanding and cemented. It's the folks on the left who do care about a better world. I said earlier, use the comment, the social justice warriors, the folks who were marching in the streets after the brutal murder of George Floyd. We marched with them as well. It doesn't mean we are all going to join Black Lives Matter, but we certainly can support the slogan and the phrase, because it is a human value and it's something we should align ourselves with. But these are folks who don't have, and I'm generalizing here, but by and large, a full picture of Israel, a full understanding of what Israel means to our own collective psyche as Jews, the sense of identity and connection that we have to Israel. And Israel doesn't have to be perfect. That's the other piece of it. I would encourage the congregation, when you're meeting with friends or neighbors or co-workers or those who may have not had the blessing of a personal connection to Israel or a visit to Israel ever in their lifetime, share a little bit about your own experience. Discuss why Israel is so important to you. And it may help to open their eyes. It may help them read an LA Times article a little bit differently, or perhaps a little more critically. And it may help them look beyond mere simplistic headlines that easily make, that tend all too often to make Israel the boogeyman.
Okay, you're very, very right. Thank you. In fact, I'm going to be having a conversation online in a few weeks with an Israeli theoretician, we call it, who's talking about finding ways to bridge the gap between Israelis and Palestinians. So when we talk about, right, the difference between attacking Israel and its right to exist altogether, and the difference between talking about, well, what do we fix? How do we fix? Well, here's an attempt, right? How can we bring people together that are at such odds? And it affects us in the United States without any question. So that I'll have more information about that later on. Richard, I want to thank you so very much. Been a very great conversation.
Always,
You're
Rabbi.
doing You're doing work in the trenches for us.
Well, I feel the love and the support of you and the congregation, and we all have our part to do. And may we enjoy strength and good health and peace and safety to be able to carry on this important work in the new year.
Thank you very much. A good year, a sweet year to you, to your family, to everyone. Shana Tova.
Shana Tova. Thank you.